Welcome to Ultimate Sleep Doctor. Tonight, we'll delve into a hidden beauty within the world around us. Consider the flow of water, the way a river moves, or the silent dance of air currents. We're exploring laminar flow, a remarkable state where fluids move in smooth, orderly layers. It's a testament to balance, a quiet demonstration of physics at its most elegant. There's a serenity in this predictable movement, a reminder that even in complexity, harmony can be found. If you find these explorations soothing, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Ultimate Sleep Doctor. Together, we can soothe more wandering minds, one peaceful night at a time. Just breathe, let your thoughts drift like the currents we're about to discover. Let's begin. Let's begin our exploration of fluid dynamics with a journey into the heart of how fluids behave, specifically focusing on laminar flow and the powerful set of equations that describe it, the Navier-Stokes equations. These aren't just fancy formulas. They represent the fundamental laws of conservation that govern every fluid, from the gentle flow of honey to the mighty rush of a river. At their core, the Navier-Stokes equations are built upon three primary conservation laws: the conservation of mass, the conservation of momentum, and the conservation of energy. These laws are expressed mathematically, and when combined with specific assumptions, they elegantly define what we mean by laminar flow. Laminar flow, simply put, is characterized by smooth, layered movement. The fluid particles move in parallel paths without any significant mixing. This contrasts sharply with turbulence, where the flow is chaotic and unpredictable. The foundation of these equations rests on the assumption of a Newtonian fluid, a fluid where the stress is linearly proportional to the strain rate. This means the resistance to flow, or viscosity, is constant and predictable. Constant viscosity is crucial. Otherwise, the equations become incredibly complex. We also assume irrotational flow, signifying that the fluid has no rotational component. This is a reasonable approximation for many flows, particularly in relatively small domains. Now, let's break down the equations. The conservation of mass states that the rate at which mass enters a volume must equal the rate at which it leaves, essentially tracking the fluid's volume. The conservation of momentum is where we introduce viscosity, which manifests as shear stress, the force per unit area that resists deformation. Velocity gradients are intimately linked to this shear stress. A steeper velocity gradient generates a greater shear stress, and vice versa. The momentum equation essentially describes how forces, including pressure and viscous forces, act on the fluid to change its velocity. Finally, the conservation of energy considers the transfer of heat within the fluid. Consider the classic example of flow over a flat plate. Applying the Navier-Stokes equations, considering the no-slip boundary condition, where the fluid velocity at the plate surface matches the plate's velocity, and assuming a constant viscosity, we arrive at a solution that accurately predicts the velocity profile, a parabolic curve showing how velocity varies across the plate. Similarly, for flow around a cylinder, the equations, alongside appropriate boundary conditions like symmetry at the cylinder's axis, allow us to calculate the drag and lift forces. When analytical solutions become too complex, we turn to numerical methods. Finite difference methods approximate the continuous equations with discrete values, allowing us to simulate the flow on a computer. However, these methods introduce approximations, and their accuracy depends on the grid size. Smaller grids generally provide more accurate results but require more computational power. A particularly important concept is the Reynolds number. Derived directly from the Navier-Stokes equations, it's a dimensionless quantity that represents the ratio of inertial forces to viscous forces. A high Reynolds number signifies that inertial forces dominate, favoring turbulence, while a low Reynolds number indicates that viscous forces are more influential, promoting laminar flow. The characteristic length scale, whether it's the plate length or the cylinder diameter, plays a critical role in determining the Reynolds number, and therefore the flow regime. Ultimately, the Navier-Stokes equations, when combined with carefully chosen assumptions and boundary conditions, provide a remarkably powerful tool for understanding and predicting fluid flow, especially in the tranquil realm of laminar flow. Let's explore how scientists actually see and measure laminar flow, moving beyond just the equations. It's surprisingly visual and detailed work. One of the simplest ways to observe laminar flow is with a transparent tube filled with water and a tiny speck of dye. When you gently swirl the water, you'll see the dye form perfectly straight, parallel streaks, a beautiful demonstration of the layered flow characteristic of laminar conditions. The key here is that the streaks don't break apart or mix. They maintain their neat lines because the fluid layers move in an orderly fashion. Now, let's talk about measuring these flow patterns more precisely. Particle image velocimetry, or PIV, is a powerful technique. It uses lasers to track the movement of incredibly tiny particles suspended in the fluid. The laser shines a pulse of light through the flow, and a second laser flashes almost instantaneously. The moving particles scatter this light, and the detectors capture the scattered light at different times. By analyzing the shift in the particle's position over time, we can determine its velocity vector, both its speed and direction. The beauty of PIV is that it provides a detailed map of the entire flow field, showing the velocity at countless points. Another way to measure velocity involves pitot tubes. These simple devices, based on Bernoulli's principle, are used to measure fluid velocity and pressure. A pitot tube has a small, sharp-edged probe that is placed directly into the flow. As the fluid passes through the probe, it speeds up, creating a pressure drop, and this pressure drop is directly related to the fluid's velocity. This principle is particularly useful in applications like aircraft airspeed measurement. Different types of flow meters offer further refinements. Orifice plates and Venturi tubes, for example, create a restriction in the flow path, generating a pressure difference that's proportional to the flow rate. These are commonly used in industrial applications to monitor fluid flow rates. However, simply measuring velocity isn't always enough. We often need to know the velocity profile, how the velocity changes across a given area. This is where probes like hot wire anemometers and ultrasonic Doppler anemometers come in. Hot wire anemometers use a heated wire. As the fluid flows over it, the resistance changes based on the fluid's velocity. Ultrasonic Doppler anemometers, on the other hand, measure velocity by analyzing the frequency shift of ultrasonic waves reflected off moving particles. Each technique has its strengths and weaknesses. Hot wire anemometers are sensitive and responsive, but can be fragile, while ultrasonic anemometers are more robust, but may require careful calibration. Throughout these measurements, it's crucial to consider experimental conditions. Fluid viscosity changes with temperature, so maintaining a stable temperature is vital. Calibration of the instruments is also paramount to ensure accurate results. Finally, data acquisition systems capture all this information, converting the raw sensor readings into digital data. Signal processing, techniques like filtering and averaging, are then applied to this data to extract the most meaningful velocity information, smoothing out noise and revealing the underlying patterns of laminar flow. Researchers frequently analyze published data from these experiments to validate their techniques and understand flow behavior under various conditions. Let's explore the fascinating world of the laminar boundary layer, a remarkably thin region that governs so much of how fluids behave. It's the area right next to a solid surface where the fluid's stickiness, its viscosity, really takes charge. To understand it fully, we'll start with a simplified set of equations derived from the broader Navier-Stokes equations, but focusing only on the flow within this boundary layer. These equations, when applied to this situation, reveal a crucial simplification. The flow is essentially irrotational, meaning there are no swirling eddies. The governing equations for the laminar boundary layer are a set of partial differential equations. Applying the assumption of irrotational flow leads to a velocity potential, phi, y, where y represents the distance away from the surface. From this, we can derive a simplified momentum equation, linking the velocity gradient to the shear stress at the wall. This shear stress is, in turn, directly proportional to the viscosity of the fluid. Now, let's talk about measuring the thickness of this boundary layer. While the average thickness can be calculated, it's often more useful to use alternative measures like the displacement thickness and momentum thickness. Displacement thickness represents the total reduction in momentum carried by the fluid across the boundary layer, while momentum thickness accounts for the difference between the total momentum flux and the momentum flux transported by the viscous stresses. These measures give us a more nuanced understanding of the boundary layer's behavior. The no-slip condition is absolutely fundamental. It states that the fluid at the wall has zero velocity relative to the wall. This creates a velocity gradient immediately adjacent to the surface. The fluid particles are striving to match the wall's speed. This intense velocity gradient is what generates the shear stress, driving the viscous effects. Consider a flat plate with a small groove. The groove introduces a surface imperfection, creating a region of slightly higher velocity due to the disturbed flow. This disturbance can act as a trigger, destabilizing the boundary layer and accelerating the transition to turbulence. Surface roughness, even at a microscopic level, has a similar effect, injecting energy into the flow. Within the boundary layer, a special region called the viscous sublayer exists. Here, the flow is dominated by viscous forces, and a logarithmic velocity profile emerges. This profile states that the velocity increases linearly from 0 at the wall to a maximum value at a distance y from the wall. The assumptions behind this logarithmic profile, laminar flow, fully developed flow, and a small disturbance, are key to its validity. The shear stress at the wall is directly proportional to the velocity gradient. A steeper gradient means a larger shear stress. Conversely, a favorable pressure gradient, where the pressure decreases in the direction of flow, tends to stabilize the boundary layer, delaying transition to turbulence. Conversely, an adverse pressure gradient, where the pressure increases, can destabilize the flow, promoting turbulence. Understanding the laminar boundary layer is crucial for designing everything from aircraft wings to pipelines. It's a delicate balance between viscous forces and pressure gradients, a world of tiny imperfections and predictable behaviors, a truly fascinating corner of fluid dynamics. Let's explore the fascinating world of fluid flow, specifically how it behaves around simple shapes. We'll start with a circular cylinder, a shape surprisingly complex in its flow dynamics. As a fluid, such as air or water, approaches a cylinder, it initially flows smoothly around it. However, due to the no-slip condition, where the fluid immediately adjacent to the surface sticks rigidly to the cylinder, a velocity gradient develops. The fluid right at the surface is momentarily halted, while the fluid further away moves faster. This creates a thin region of high velocity, called the boundary layer, which grows along the cylinder's length. Within this boundary layer, viscous forces dominate, and the flow becomes significantly altered. The pressure distribution around the cylinder isn't uniform. It's highest at the front and decreases gradually towards the rear. This pressure difference generates a net force acting on the cylinder, drag. The drag coefficient, a dimensionless number reflecting the drag force, is a key value in characterizing this flow. It's influenced by the cylinder's diameter and the fluid's viscosity. A larger diameter, or a more viscous fluid, will typically result in a higher drag coefficient. Now, let's consider what happens when the cylinder rotates. This introduces a fascinating phenomenon known as the Hagenstrom vortex. As the cylinder spins, the fluid dragged along with it creates swirling patterns, vortices, around the cylinder's circumference. These vortices are stabilized by the viscous forces within the boundary layer. The strength of these vortices, and therefore the magnitude of the drag, depends critically on the rotation speed. Next, let's revisit flow over a flat plate. We've previously discussed the boundary layer's development, but its influence is especially pronounced over longer plates. The length of the plate significantly impacts the boundary layer's growth rate. A longer plate allows the boundary layer to expand further, increasing the drag. Surface smoothness plays a crucial role here. A smoother surface minimizes turbulence within the boundary layer, reducing drag. Conversely, surface imperfections, like even small grooves, can disrupt the laminar flow, promoting the onset of turbulence and dramatically increasing the drag coefficient. Finally, let's turn our attention to more streamlined bodies, like airfoils, the wings of an airplane. At the leading edge, the boundary layer initially develops rapidly, and a key phenomenon emerges: the formation of a leading-edge vortex. This swirling flow creates a region of low pressure above the wing. This low-pressure region contributes significantly to lift generation, a crucial aspect of flight. The strength of the leading-edge vortex, and consequently the lift produced, is affected by factors such as the airfoil's shape, the angle of attack, the angle between the wing and the oncoming airflow, and the Reynolds number, which, as we've discussed, provides a vital indication of the relative importance of viscous and inertial forces. Within the laminar regime, precise control of these parameters is essential for achieving optimal lift and minimizing drag. A delicate balance of forces governing the flow around these shapes. Let's consider the flow of a fluid, perhaps water rushing through a pipe or air moving around an airplane. The way it behaves depends critically on a single, powerful number, the Reynolds number. It's a deceptively simple calculation, but it holds the key to understanding whether a flow will remain smooth and orderly, or if it will quickly erupt into a chaotic dance of turbulence. The Reynolds number is calculated by combining two fundamental forces: inertial forces and viscous forces. Inertial forces are those related to the fluid's momentum, how much it wants to keep moving in a straight line. Viscous forces, on the other hand, are the forces exerted by the fluid itself, resisting this motion and trying to maintain order. The formula is quite straightforward. Rho equals rho Vd/mu, where rho is the fluid's density, v is the characteristic velocity of the flow, d is a characteristic length scale, often the diameter of a pipe, and mu is the dynamic viscosity of the fluid. Essentially, a higher Reynolds number indicates that inertial forces are dominant, while a lower Reynolds number signifies that viscous forces are holding the flow together. Think of it like this: a fast-moving river, high V, will be much more likely to become turbulent than a slow-moving stream, low V. The choice of D depends on the geometry. For flow around a cylinder, it's the cylinder's diameter. The critical Reynolds number is the specific value at which turbulence is predicted to begin. It's not a single, universal number. It varies depending on the shape of the flow and the fluid properties. For flow in a circular pipe, a critical Reynolds number of around 2300 is a commonly cited value, though this can shift depending on minor variations in conditions. Below this number, the flow remains perfectly laminar, with smooth, layered movement. Above it, turbulence becomes increasingly probable. It's important to understand that this isn't a guarantee of transition, it's a probability threshold. However, the behavior of flow isn't always so simple. The mechanisms driving this transition are fascinating. Instabilities, like Kelvin-Helmholtz instabilities, often initiate the process. These instabilities arise when two layers of fluid flow alongside each other at different speeds, creating swirling motions that can quickly amplify into turbulence. Another key mechanism is the formation of Tolmian-Schlichting waves. These are large-scale, wave-like disturbances that grow and eventually break, leading to chaotic flow. Scientists use clever tools to observe these instabilities. Schlieren photography, for example, uses light distortion to visualize density variations within the flow, revealing the swirling patterns of these waves. Similarly, smoke visualization, carefully injecting smoke into the flow, allows researchers to directly see the chaotic movements that characterize turbulence. These techniques offer a remarkably direct view into the intricate dynamics of flow instability. Furthermore, even minor imperfections can significantly influence the critical Reynolds number. Wall roughness, for instance, tiny bumps and irregularities on the surface, can introduce disturbances that trigger transition at lower Reynolds numbers. Similarly, flow asymmetry, a non-uniform distribution of velocity, can dramatically alter the flow's behavior. The transition process isn't an abrupt event, it's a gradual shift. At lower Reynolds numbers, the flow may exhibit small, localized bursts of turbulence. As the Reynolds number increases, these bursts become more frequent and widespread, eventually dominating the overall flow pattern. The flow transitions through distinct regimes. Initially, intermittent turbulence occurs. Then, as the Reynolds number continues to climb, the turbulence becomes more continuous and intense, ultimately leading to a fully turbulent flow. Observing this progression, through careful measurement and visualization, allows scientists to deepen our understanding of this complex phenomenon. Let's explore how scientists can actually see and understand the flow of laminar fluid, not just with our eyes, but with powerful computers. It's like building a miniature world within a computer to study the way liquids move. We do this through something called computational fluid dynamics, or CFD. At its heart, CFD uses a technique called the finite volume method to solve the complex equations that govern fluid flow, specifically the Navier-Stokes equations. These equations describe how forces, like pressure and viscosity, affect the motion of the fluid. The first step is to imagine dividing the fluid flow into many tiny, small volumes. Think of these volumes as little boxes, each representing a small piece of the overall flow. Instead of trying to solve for the entire flow at once, we solve the equations for each of these tiny boxes. This is the finite volume part. We're dealing with discrete volumes. We then add up the results from all these individual boxes to get an overall solution for the entire flow. Now, how do we create these tiny boxes? This is where meshing comes in. We create a grid of these boxes, which is often called a mesh. The finer the mesh, the smaller the boxes, the more accurate our simulation will be, but it also requires more computing power. Generating this grid is an art in itself. The mesh must be arranged in a way that accurately represents the flow geometry. We can use specialized software to automatically create meshes, but sometimes, especially around complex shapes, we need to refine the mesh manually. Let's say we want to simulate the flow of a thin layer of fluid around a flat plate. We'd start by creating a mesh of boxes covering the plate and the surrounding space. Then, we'd input the Navier-Stokes equations into the computer, telling it that we're interested in the flow around this plate. The computer would then solve these equations for each box in the mesh, calculating the velocity and pressure at each point. One of the key challenges is dealing with errors. Because we're using a discrete approximation of a continuous system, there will always be some error. To manage this, we use what's called a convergence criterion. We set a target value for the error and stop the calculation when the solution changes very little between iterations. Essentially, we're telling the computer to keep calculating until the answer stabilizes. We also monitor other metrics, such as the change in velocity or pressure, to ensure a robust convergence. The finite volume method offers several advantages. It's particularly well-suited for complex geometries and turbulent flows, though we're focusing on laminar flow here. However, it's important to recognize its limitations. The accuracy of the solution depends heavily on the mesh quality and the chosen numerical schemes. Furthermore, the computational cost can be substantial, especially for high Reynolds number flows. Finally, post-processing the results is where we turn these numbers into something we can understand. We can visualize the velocity field, a map showing the speed and direction of the fluid at each point, or calculate quantities like drag and lift. This allows us to gain a detailed understanding of the flow behavior and predict its characteristics. It's a powerful tool, transforming complex equations into a visual and measurable reality. The gentle hum of circulatory fluids is a constant, quiet rhythm within every living thing. Let's consider, for a moment, the intricate dance of blood flow through the human body, a perfect example of laminar flow. Within the arteries and veins, blood doesn't swirl and tumble like a chaotic river. Instead, it moves in smooth, layered streams. The velocity profile is key here. The blood speed is highest at the center of the vessel, closest to the artery wall, and gradually decreases towards the edges, creating distinct layers. This distribution is heavily influenced by the vessel's geometry. Narrower sections, like the spiraling curves of the aorta, further sharpen the speed gradients. The walls of these vessels are coated with a thin layer of cells called the endothelium. This isn't just a protective barrier, it's intimately connected to the flow itself. The shear stress created by the moving blood, the force exerted by the fluid on the wall, profoundly affects these endothelial cells. This wall shear stress can trigger signaling pathways within the cells, influencing their behavior, promoting the synthesis of nitric oxide, a molecule that helps relax blood vessels, or conversely, stimulating the expression of adhesion molecules involved in inflammation. It's a delicate balance orchestrated by the laminar flow. Now let's delve into the brain. The cerebrospinal fluid, CSF, which cushions the brain and spinal cord, also flows through the system in a predominantly laminar fashion. This flow is crucial for removing metabolic waste products, delivering nutrients, and maintaining optimal brain function. The intricate network of channels and spaces within the brain's tissue facilitates this steady, organized movement. Outside of these large vessels, we find laminar flow in the respiratory system. Air moves through the trachea and bronchi, branching into smaller and smaller airways. The flow is carefully controlled, essential for efficient gas exchange in the lungs. However, even slight disruptions to this laminar flow, perhaps due to airway narrowing or inflammation, can have serious consequences, potentially triggering asthma or other respiratory ailments. Consider, too, the flow within tissues themselves. Within muscle tissue, for example, nutrients and oxygen diffuse through the matrix towards cells, carried by fluid films moving in a laminar fashion. Simultaneously, waste products like carbon dioxide are carried away, again guided by this organized flow. This precise, layered movement is the key to sustaining cellular life within the deeper layers of our bodies. The beauty of these biological flows lies in their efficiency. They represent a remarkable example of how a simple principle, the orderly movement of fluids, can be fundamental to the complex workings of life, sustaining everything from the smallest cell to the largest organ. It's a gentle, consistent rhythm, a testament to the elegance of natural systems. As we've explored the gentle dance of laminar flow, we've arrived at a point where the simple equations of the Navier-Stokes model begin to feel insufficient. The world, especially when it comes to fluid dynamics, rarely presents itself in perfectly smooth, orderly lines. Instead, we need tools that can capture the complexities that arise when a flow becomes disturbed, even if it's only momentarily. This is where turbulence modeling steps in. These models don't actually simulate turbulent flow. That's an incredibly complex undertaking. Instead, they provide approximate solutions, clever mathematical shortcuts that allow us to predict the effects of turbulence within a simulation where we're still operating under the assumption of a generally laminar flow. Two of the most common are the K-epsilon and K-omega models. The K represents turbulent kinetic energy, a measure of the intensity of the fluctuations, while epsilon and omega relate to the dissipation rate of that energy. Essentially, these models predict how this kinetic energy is created and then broken down, a simplified but surprisingly effective representation of what's happening. A particularly useful technique is the application of wall functions. Near solid surfaces, like the walls of a pipe or the surface of a wing, the flow becomes inherently more complex. The Navier-Stokes equations become difficult to solve directly. Wall functions offer a way to bypass some of this complexity. They relate the turbulent kinetic energy and the dissipation rate, which we've just discussed, to the velocity at the wall, based on the overall flow conditions. It's like saying, based on what's happening in the bulk of the flow, we can estimate what's happening right at the wall. Now, let's consider situations where we have multiple fluids interacting. For example, a mixture of liquid and gas. Multi-phase flow simulations allow us to model this with laminar assumptions where appropriate. We can represent the different phases, like air bubbles in water, using different mathematical descriptions, accounting for the momentum exchange between them. This approach allows us to understand the complex mixing and transport phenomena that arise. Another powerful tactic involves validating and refining our numerical models with experimental data. Often, the initial simulations are imperfect. We might find discrepancies between the predicted flow patterns and what's observed in a physical experiment. This triggers an iterative process. We adjust the model parameters, refine the mesh, the grid used to discretize the flow domain, and rerun the simulation. This constant feedback loop, comparing simulation results to experiment, is crucial for building accurate and reliable flow models. Finally, remember that even within a generally laminar flow, there can be small-scale turbulence, eddies, and swirls. These are often captured and accounted for within the chosen turbulence model, allowing us to build a truly comprehensive picture of the flow. It's a fascinating and continually evolving field, pushing the boundaries of our understanding of how fluids move and interact. If you're still awake and enjoyed this exploration, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Ultimate Sleep Doctor. Together, we can soothe more wandering minds, one peaceful night at a time. We've journeyed through the gentle currents of laminar flow, a quiet dance of fluid movement. Let your thoughts drift now, calm and unhurried, like water smoothing over stone. Good night.